The emergency broadcast cut through the peaceful hum of the Galactic Council chambers like a blade through silk, and every representative in the Grand Hall felt their blood run cold at the sound of pure terror in the transmission. "This is Mining Colony Talos 7 calling any vessel in range." The voice crackled with static and fear. "We have suffered catastrophic structural failure in the primary extraction zone, and 3,000 workers are trapped below the surface with limited oxygen supply." Council Speaker Theron of the Valorian Concord raised one slender hand for silence as the entire assembly listened to the desperate plea continuing from the speakers overhead. "The main shaft has collapsed completely, and secondary tunnels are unstable." The voice went on, and everyone could hear the barely controlled panic beneath the professional tone. "Environmental conditions at the trapped zone are extreme, and rescue equipment cannot penetrate the debris field without causing further collapse. And we are requesting immediate assistance from any qualified rescue operations in the sector." The message repeated twice more before falling silent, and leaving only the shocked murmurs of 300 species trying to process what they had just heard. Theron looked to the emergency response coordinator and a six-limbed Krell named Vorith, who was already pulling up data on the holographic display at the center of the chamber. "Tal 7 is a Varani mining operation," Vorith announced, and his voice carried the weight of bad news. "The colony sits on a high-gravity world with significant seismic activity, and the planet registers as a Class 9 hazard environment." "What are the conditions at the collapse site?" asked Ambassador Lyra of the Sultani Federation. Vorth's mandibles clicked together nervously as he read the incoming data. "Gravity is measured at 2.3 times. Standard and atmospheric temperature at the trapped zone is 56 degrees Celsius with toxic gas. Concentrations rising, and structural integrity is compromised throughout the affected area with ongoing aftershocks every 12 to 18 minutes." A heavy silence fell over the chamber as the implications became clear to everyone present. Those conditions would kill most of our rescue specialists within minutes, Theron said quietly, and his words were a death sentence for the 3,000 Varani trapped below, even with environmental suits and the structural instability makes drone operations impossibly dangerous. We cannot simply abandon them. Lyra protested, but her voice lacked conviction because she knew the mathematics of survival as well as anyone. "No one is suggesting we abandon them," Vorith replied, and his tone was gentle despite the harsh reality. "But we must be realistic about what is physically possible, and which species in the Council have the physiological capacity to survive those conditions long enough to mount a rescue." The Assembly began reviewing the data, and species after species confirmed what everyone already knew, and the Krell could not survive the gravity, and the Sultani would succumb to heat exhaustion in under an hour, and the Valorians lacked the physical strength to move debris, and the Netherians could not process the toxic atmosphere. Even with filtration, what about the Korbak's military units? Someone suggested they can handle the gravity, Vorith acknowledged. But their exoskeleton-based physiology makes them vulnerable to the heat, and their metabolic rate would require oxygen consumption that exceeds what we could supply in that environment. The debate continued for another 20 minutes and grew more desperate and more futile as each potential solution was examined and discarded, and the reality settled over the chamber like a shroud because 3,000 lives were slipping away, and the most advanced civilization in the galaxy could do nothing but watch. Then a new voice cut into the Council frequency. "Galactic Council chambers, this is the human delegation ship Terra Nova." The voice was crisp and professional, with an accent unfamiliar to most Council members. "We have intercepted the distress call from Talos 7 and are requesting permission to render assistance." Every head in the chamber turned toward the human observation pod where the newest potential members of the galactic community sat, and humanity had made first contact only 3 months earlier. And they were still in the early stages of cultural integration, and they did not even have provisional Council status yet. Theron activated his communication link with visible confusion. "Terra Nova, we appreciate your concern, but this is a Council emergency response matter, and the environmental conditions at Talos 7 are beyond standard safety parameters." "Understood." Council speaker, the human, responded, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was smiling. "We have reviewed the environmental data from the colony, and have determined that our rescue specialists are qualified for the Operation Voroth. Leaned toward his own microphone with his mandibles, clicking in what might have been either amusement or disbelief. Terra Nova, the conditions include 2.3 standard gravity and temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius and toxic, atmospheric composition, an ongoing seismic instability, and no species in the Council can safely operate in that environment. For the duration required, yes, Coordinator, we saw the data, the human voice replied calmly. Those conditions are comparable to certain regions of our homeworld, and our rescue personnel train in similar and sometimes more extreme environments as standard protocol. The council chamber erupted in confused chatter because that statement made no sense whatsoever. Terra Nova, are you saying your homeworld regularly experiences these hazard levels? Theron asked, and his voice carried genuine concern for a species that evolved in such nightmare conditions in certain regions. Yes. The human confirmed. Our homeworld registers as what we believe you classify as a Class 12 hazard environment with variable gravity zones and extreme temperature ranges and diverse toxic atmospheric pockets and significant seismic and volcanic activity in our species evolved to adapt to these conditions. Class 12 was a designation reserved for worlds so hostile that they should not support complex life, and certainly not sentient civilization that is impossible. Someone whispered, but the words carried across the silent chamber nevertheless. The human continued, and his voice took on a tone of gentle urgency. We have a rescue ship already en route to Talos 7 with a full crew of miners and engineers, and emergency medical specialists, and we are equipped for high gravity, high temperature operations with structural collapse protocols, and we expect to arrive at the colony in approximately 4 hours. You are already en route, Theron repeated, and he could not keep the shock from his voice. Yes, sir, the human said, and now there was definitely warmth in his tone. We left our delegation station approximately 6 minutes after intercepting the distress call, and we did not want to waste time waiting for authorization when lives are at stake. But we are now formally requesting permission to attempt the rescue Operation Voroth. Was frantically pulling up what little data that Council had on human physiology, and his expression grew more alarmed with each passing second. Their baseline gravity is 0.98 standard, he announced to the chamber. They evolved in conditions only 0.32 below the Talos 7 collapse site, and their temperature tolerance, Lyra asked, their homeworld equatorial regions regularly exceed 60 degrees Celsius. Voroth read, and his voice was almost reverent with disbelief. They have documented physiological adaptations for extreme heat endurance. The implications washed over the assembly like a wave. These newcomers, these strange bipedal mammals from a world that tried to kill them every single day, had heard a cry for help and had not hesitated and had not debated and had simply gone Terra Nova, Theron said, and his voice was thick with emotion he did not try to hide. You have authorization to proceed with rescue operations, and the Council will provide any support and resources you require, and may fortune favor your courage. Thank you, Council Speaker, the human replied. We will keep you updated on our progress and Terra Nova out. The chamber remained silent for a long moment. After the transmission ended, finally Lyra spoke what everyone was thinking. What kind of world creates a species like that? What? Voroth answered quietly. They come from a death world, and they are going into hell itself to save people. They have never met. Theron looked at the data streaming from Talos 7, and the oxygen counters ticking down toward 0, and the seismic sensors showing another aftershock building. Then let us pray, he said softly, that Deathworlders are as resilient as they are brave. The waiting began. The human rescue ship Indomitable dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the Talos 7 system, and every sensor in the Galactic Council observation fleet locked onto it. Immediately, the vessel was unlike anything most species had seen before, and it was built with harsh angles and reinforced plating and what appeared to be redundant systems layered throughout its structure, as if the designers expected everything to break and needed backups. For the backups, Council observers, this is Captain Maria Santos of the Indomitable, a calm voice announced over the open channel. We are beginning our approach to the colony, and request that all non-essential vessels maintain a safe distance from the operational zone. Theron watched from his command ship as the Indomitable burned hard toward the planet, and its approach vector was far more aggressive than any council vessel would dare attempt. Captain Santos, your approach speed is exceeding recommended. Safety parameters for this gravity well. The Valorian flight coordinator warned. Acknowledged, coordinator. Santos replied without any change in her trajectory. Our structural integrity can handle the stress, and time is critical. The ship hit the atmosphere like a meteor in its heat, shields glowing white-hot as it punched through the upper layers with what seemed like reckless abandon, but was clearly precise calculation. Foth was monitoring the telemetry from his station, and his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the data. Their hull is experiencing temperatures that would vaporize most council vessels, and their inertial dampeners are compensating for GI forces that would liquefy our internal organs, and they are not even slowing down. The Indomitable descended toward the mining colony in a controlled fall that defied every safety regulation in the Council Codex, and touched down on the landing pad with a grace that contradicted its brutal approach. The cargo bay doors opened before the engines finished cycling. Down what emerged made every observer lean closer to their displays. Humans, in environmental suits, walked down the ramp, and each one carrying equipment that looked heavy, even by human standards, and their movements were quick and efficient and purposeful. In the 2.3 gravity that would have pinned most species to the ground, dear merciful void, Lyra whispered from her observation ship. They are moving in that gravity as if it were nothing, not nothing, Boreth corrected while studying his readouts. Their biometric data shows significant cardiovascular strain and increased respiration rates and elevated core temperatures, but they are compensating through what appears to be trained adaptation, and their muscle density is nearly 3 times that of comparable species. The Varani colony administrator approached the human team, and his movements slow and labored in the gravity of his own adopted world. Captain Santos, he said, and his translator carrying the exhaustion in his voice. I am Administrator Kelvin, and I must tell you that we appreciate your response, but the conditions below are truly deadly, and we cannot ask you to sacrifice your people for ours. Human woman removed her helmet and revealed a face that was weathered and strong and kind. Administrator, you did not ask. She said with a slight smile, we volunteered, and my team has reviewed the structural data and environmental readings, and we have handled similar situations on Earth, on your homeworld. Kelvin's eyes widened. You have disasters like this on your own planet? Cave-ins and mine collapses and earthquake rescues? Santos nodded. We have been pulling people out of impossible situations for thousands of years, and it is what we do. A massive human approached in his environmental suit marked with symbols indicating engineering specialty. Ma'am, the scanning drones have mapped the collapse zone. He reported in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. We have 3 viable approach vectors, and structural reinforcement will be needed along the primary route. But it is doable. Doable is all we need, Jackson, Santos replied. Get the teams organized, and I want Chen's group on the primary shaft and Martinez on secondary support, and Okonkwo prepping the medical station. The humans moved with startling coordination, and their communication clipped and professional as they unloaded equipment and organized into teams and began the descent toward Hell itself. The council observers watched the video feeds as the first human team entered the collapsed mine system. The conditions were immediately apparent, and the walls glowed with heat, and the air shimmered with toxic gases and debris, shifted constantly under the stress of ongoing tremors. Temperature reading at entry point is 54 degrees Celsius, Voroth announced, rising to 58 degrees as they descend on the video feed. A human named Chen wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned at his companion. Remember that extraction job in the Atacama Desert? Asked while hauling a support beam that must have weighed 200 kilograms. Yeah, that was worse. His companion laughed. At least here we have cooling systems in the suits. The casual conversation in the face of mortal danger left the council observers speechless. They are joking, Lyra said in disbelief. They are walking into conditions that would kill us in minutes, and they are joking. The human teams reached the first group of trapped Varani workers. Then 40 minutes of entering the mine, and the trapped workers huddled in a small pocket that was slowly filling with toxic fumes. Hey there, folks. A human voice called through the darkness, and a bright light cut through the gloom. I am Rescue Specialist Jackson. and we are here to get you out, and can anyone tell me if there are injuries in this group? The Varani stared at the massive figure that barely fit through the cramped tunnel, and his environmental suit scorched and torn from scraping through the debris field you came. One of the Varani whispered. We thought no one could survive this. Jackson knelt down to their level, and his movements careful, despite his size. We are a bit harder to kill than most, and now let us get you topside, where the air does not taste. Like sulfur, the extraction began, and earnest humans worked in teams of 4 and moving through the unstable tunnels with a combination of caution and speed that seemed contradictory, but was clearly practiced when equipment failed. They used their own strength, and when passages were too narrow for stretchers they carried Varani workers in their arms, and when support beams needed to be placed, they did it with their bare hands because the mechanical lifters could not fit. Administrator Kelvin watched from the Surface Command Center, and his face cycling through expressions of awe and disbelief. How are they doing this? He asked Voreth, who had joined him to monitor the Operation Evolutionary Adaptation. Voreth replied while studying the biometric data streaming from the human suits. Their homeworld subjected them to constant lethal challenges, in their species responded by becoming nearly indestructible, and their bone density is remarkable. And their cardiovascular system is incredibly efficient, and their temperature regulation exceeds anything we have documented, and most importantly, their psychological conditioning appears to eliminate panic response under extreme stress. On the screens, a human woman named Sarah Martinez was working to shore up a collapsing tunnel, and her movements steady and deliberate as rocks fell around. Martinez, we are reading a stress fracture in the overhead support. A voice warned through her CUM system. Recommend immediate evacuation of that sector. Negative, Martinez replied calmly. I have 5 Varani workers 20 meters beyond this point, and if this tunnel goes, they are cut off from all other rescue routes, and I am almost done with the reinforcement. She continued working, even as the mountain groaned around her, and her hands never shaking as she secured the final support beam just seconds before a massive slab of rock crashed down onto the structure she had built. The support held. Told you I was almost done, Martinez said with a breathless laugh. Now let me get these folks out of here. 12 hours into the operation, a human named David Okonkwo was treating a Varani child in one of the isolated pockets when another tremor shook the entire complexity. Tunnel behind him collapsed completely and cutting him off from the rest of the rescue team, Okonkwo report. Santos called over the CUM. I am fine, Captain, Okonkwo responded, and there was no fear in his voice. Trapped with one patient and a very scared little girl, but we have air and water, and I have medical supplies, and I am not going anywhere without her. Through the video feed from his helmet camera, the council observers watched as Okonkwo sat down next to the frightened Varani child. Hey there, small one, he said gently. My name is David, and I am going to stay right here with you until my friends dig us out. And would you like to hear a story about the oceans on my planet? The child nodded, and her eyes wide with terror. On Earth, we have these massive bodies of water called oceans, Okonkwo began, in his voice warm and soothing. And in these oceans there are creatures so big that they make this whole mountain look small. For 6 hours, Okonkwo told stories and kept the child calm while his team dug through solid rock to reach them when they finally broke through. Jackson's face was streaked with dust and blood from a cut on his forehead. Sorry for the delay, Doc, Jackson said with a tired grin. This rock was being stubborn, no rush, Okonkwo replied, while gently lifting the child. We were just getting to the good part about the blue whales. The 24th hour of the rescue operation brought the crisis. Everyone had feared a massive aftershock ripped through the mine complex, and the largest yet in tunnels that had been merely unstable became active. Death traps as support structures failed, and new collapses cascaded through the underground network chains. Team was halfway through evacuating the deepest pocket of trapped workers when the entire section above them gave way. All teams evacuate to safe zones immediately, Santos ordered from the Surface Command Center, and her calm voice cracking for the first time with urgency. We have multiple structural failures across sectors 7 through 12, negative, Captain, Chen responded, and the sound of falling rock nearly drowning out his words. We still have 47 Varani in the deep zone, and if we pull out now, they will be completely cut off. Santos closed her eyes for a moment, and every observer in the command center saw the weight of command settle on her shoulders. Chun-Yu, have maybe 10 minutes before that entire section comes down, she said quietly. Then, we better work fast, Chen replied, and there was actually humor in his voice. Jackson, I need you and your team to hold that support beam in place manually while we get these people through. You want us to hold up a mountain? Chen said, well, when you put it that way. Jackson laughed, and the sound was almost manic. Sure, why not? The video feed showed for humans positioning themselves under a massive concrete support beam that was cracking under the strain of thousands of tons of rock above. They braced their shoulders against it, and their legs driving into the floor, and their entire bodies becoming living pillars. This is insane, Lyra whispered from her observation ship. They cannot possibly hold that weight, but they did. Biometric readings showed heart rates exceeding 200 beats per minute and muscle tissue experiencing micro tears and bones creaking under compression forces that would have shattered any other species. And they held Chen's team, moved the Varani workers through the failing tunnel one by one, in each human, carrying 2 or 3 of the smaller aliens, while the 4 under the beam bought them time with their own bodies. 30 seconds. One of the humans holding the beam grunted, and his voice strained but not panicked. My legs are going numb. 20 more seconds. Chen called back. Last group coming through now. Take your time. The human gasped, and somehow he was still attempting humor. We're just holding up a casual few thousand tons here. The last Varani worker passed through the checkpoint just as the concrete beam began to splinter clear. Chen shouted, everyone out now. The 4 humans released the beam and dove forward, and rolled through the tunnel opening as the entire section behind them collapsed with a roar that shook the entire planet. They emerged covered in dust and bleeding from a dozen cuts, and one of them was limping badly. Everyone accounted for? Santos asked all present. Captain? Jackson confirmed while helping his injured teammate stand. Though I think I am going to need a new spine after this. Get to medical, Santos ordered. And Jackson? Yes, Captain. Outstanding work. The rescue continued in Sector 9. A human named Sarah Martinez was working alone to clear a debris field when a support cable snapped and a 2-ton piece of machinery fell directly toward a group of trapped Varani below. Martinez threw herself forward and got her hands under the falling metal in her augmented suit servos, screaming in protest as she arrested its father. Impact drove her to her knees, and her right arm breaking with an audible crack that transmitted clearly over her cum. Sister Martinez status. Santos called immediately. Compound fracture, right radius and ulna. Martinez reported through gritted teeth and her voice tight with pain but still professional. But I have the debris stabilized, and the workers are safe. Pull back to medical immediately. Santos ordered. Negative, Captain, Martinez replied, and she was already moving again, using her left arm to operate her tools. I have 6 more support struts to place before this section is stable enough for extraction, and my left arm works fine, and I can finish this. Martinez. That is an order. With respect, Captain. Time is critical, and these people need this tunnel stable more than I need a splint right now, and I can work with 1 arm, and I will get medical attention after I finish this section. And Martinez out. She kept working for 6 more hours. Martinez placed supports and cleared debris and guided Varani workers to safety, and all with 1 arm hanging useless at her side and pain medication from her suit's medical system. Barely keeping her conscious when she finally emerged to the surface, she had evacuated 93 Varani from what had been classified as an unrecoverable zone. The medical team rushed to her, and she waved them off with her good hand. Check the Varani first, she insisted. They had been breathing toxic air for 30 hours, and I can wait another 20 minutes. Administrator Kelvin approached her as the medics argued, and his expression was something between reverence and horror. Why would you do that, Iferd? He asked. Why would you continue working in such pain for people you do not even know? Martinez looked at him with exhausted eyes, and her face was gray with pain and blood loss because they needed help. She said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the galaxy, and I could provide it. She collapsed a moment later, and the medics catching her before she hit the ground. In the deep tunnels, David Okonkwo was still trapped with the Varani child and his rescue team working furiously to reach them through solid rock. How are you doing down there, Doc? Santos asked. During one of the regular check-ins. We are fine, Captain, Okonkwo replied, and his voice was steady despite 30 hours in a coffin of stone. Young Talia here has been teaching me Varani songs, and I have been teaching her Earth songs, and we are having quite a cultural exchange. The child's voice came through the come and high, and frightened but trying to be brave. Will your friends really reach us? It's absolutely small one, Okonkwo said with complete confidence. Humans are very stubborn, and when we decide to dig someone out, nothing stops us, and not rock, and not heat, and not gravity, and nothing are all. Humans like you? The child asked. Like me specifically? Okonkwo chuckled. No, we come in all different types, but are we all stubborn about helping people? Yes, I would say that is pretty universal with us. The drilling sounds grew louder. Hear that? Okonkwo said. That is the sound of my friends being stubborn, and they will have us out soon. 12 hours after they were trapped, the rescue team broke through, and Jackson's massive frame filling the new opening dock. You have got to stop getting trapped in holes, Jackson said with a grin. This is becoming a bad habit. I will work on that, Okonkwo replied, while lifting the child gently. But first, let us get Talia here somewhere with fresh air and better lighting. As they emerged into the main tunnel, the child looked up at the massive humans surrounding her. You really came from a planet that is this dangerous all the time? She asked in wonder, more or less. Jackson confirmed. And you still help people? Especially then, Okonkwo said softly. Because we know what it is like to need help. The 31st hour brought both triumph and tragedies. Massive section of the mine complex that had been considered stable suddenly collapsed, entrapping Chen's entire team along with the 50 Varani workers. They were evacuating all teams. This is Chen. The voice came through the come and calm despite the chaos audible in the background. We have a major collapse in Sector 4, and we are cut off from all primary routes, and atmosphere is compromised. And we have multiple injuries, both human. And Varani Santos pulled up the structural maps, and her face going pale as she saw the situation.
Chen.
The only way to reach you requires going through 3 separate collapse zones, she said, and the despair creeping into her voice. The risk of another cascade failure is 90% understood, Captain, Chen replied. But we are not giving up on these people. I am not asking you to give up, Santos said, and her voice breaking. I am asking you to survive. There was a pause, and then Chen spoke again, and his words carrying across every comm channel in the entire operation. Captain, we are humans from Earth, said, and his voice was fierce with pride. We do not know how to give up, and we will dig, and we will fight, and we will protect these people until our last breath, and that is what we do, and that is who we are. From the command center, Administrator Kelvin watched as every single human in the rescue operation turned toward the collapsed sector. Who is ordering them to attempt this suicide mission? He asked Vorath. No one. Vorath replied, and his voice filled with something like awe. They are choosing this themselves. The humans began digging. They tore through rock with their bare hands when equipment failed, and they braced collapsing tunnels with their own bodies. And they shared their oxygen supplies with Varani workers, even as their own reserves ran critically low. Jackson led the rescue team in his massive strength, opening passages that should have been impossible. Martinez worked one-handed beside him, and her broken arm, now splinted but still used. Okonkwo treated injuries in the darkness while the mountain groaned around them. Chen held his team together through sheer force of will. 7 hours later, with oxygen supplies at critical levels and structural integrity at 0%, the rescue teams broke through to Chen's position. The news feeds across 300 civilized worlds broadcast the same image simultaneously: humans emerging from the Talos 7 mining tunnels in their environmental suits, torn and scorched, and their faces exhausted beyond measure. But every single one of them was smiling as they carried or supported or walked beside the Varani workers they had pulled from certain death. The footage was raw and unedited and showed the truth of what had happened in those terrible 31 hours. It showed Jackson carrying 3 Varani children on his shoulders, while blood ran down his face from a gash across his forehead. Showed Martinez with her broken arm cradled against her chest, guiding an elderly Varani worker through a narrow passage with infinite patience. It showed Okonkwo singing Earth songs with a group of rescued workers, while medics worked on his concussion. It showed Chin standing at the tunnel entrance, counting each rescued worker as they passed, and refusing to leave until Every single person was accounted for, but most of all it showed. Captain Santos standing before the assembled press corps of the galaxy, with Administrator Kelvin beside her. Captain Santos. A Valorian journalist began, and her voice carrying the shock that every species was feeling. You and your crew accomplished what the entire Galactic Council deemed impossible, and you suffered injuries that would have killed most species, and yet you succeeded, and can you explain how humanity was capable of this? Santos looked tired, and her eyes were red from 31 hours without sleep, and her uniform was still covered in dust from the tunnels. I think you are asking the wrong question, she said quietly. The question is not how we were capable of this, and the question is how could we not attempt it? I do not understand. The journalist replied, 3,000 people needed help, Santos explained, and her voice growing stronger. They were dying, and we had the ability to reach them. And so we went, and that is not complicated math. But the danger, another journalist began, is irrelevant. Santos interrupted gently. Danger is always part of the equation when lives are at stake, and you do not weigh your own safety against someone else's survival, and you just act. A Krell reporter raised one of his 6 limbs. Captain, many species are expressing concern about humanity's capabilities. And if you can survive conditions that kill other species, what else might you be capable of, and should the galaxy be worried? Santos smiled, and it was a sad, knowing expression. Let me tell you what humanity is capable of, she said, and her words carrying to every corner of civilized space. We are capable of walking into hell to pull out strangers, and we are capable of breaking our own bodies to protect others. And we are capable of sharing our last breath of oxygen with someone we just met, and we are capable of staying calm when mountains fall on us, and we are capable of singing songs to frighten children in the dark. She paused, and her eyes scanning the assembled journalists. Yes, we come from a world that tried to kill us every single day of our evolution. Santos continued, yes, we are physically resilient beyond what most species consider normal, and yes, we can survive in environments that you would classify as lethal, but do you know what that really means? The crowd waited in absolute silence. It means we learned very early in our history that survival is not a solo activity, Santa said, and her voice was fierce with conviction. It means we learned that when disaster strikes, you help your neighbor because tomorrow might be the one who needs help. And it means we learn that the strongest among us have a responsibility to protect the weakest. And it means we learn that no one survives. Alone, Administrator Kelvin stepped forward, and his voice amplified across the feeds. The Varani people owe humanity a debt that can never be repaid, he said, and his words trembling with emotion. These beings from a world we cannot even imagine came to our darkest hour and gave everything. They had, and they asked for nothing in return, and they expected nothing in return, and they simply helped. Because they could, he turned to Santos, and his eyes brimming with tears. You asked, how could you not attempt it? Kelvin said, but Captain Santos, I have been part of galactic civilization for 40 years, and I have never seen anyone else ask that question, and most species would have calculated the risk and determined it was too high, and most species would have sent their condolences instead of their rescue teams. But you came and you bled for us, and you broke for us, and you suffered for us. The feeds showed Varani workers in medical tents being treated by human doctors who were themselves injured, and showed Varani children playing with human engineers who should have been resting, and showed 2 civilizations that had been strangers 31 hours ago, now linked by bonds forged in darkness and desperation. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 3 days after the rescue. Theron stood at the center of the great chamber, and the weight of history on his shoulders. We are gathered to address the matter of humanity's application for council membership, he began, and to discuss the implications of recent events at Talos 7. The Sultani delegation leader stood, and her voice carrying clearly through the hall. I move that we grant humanity full council membership immediately, with no provisional period, and no probationary status, and no restrictions whatsoever. A shocked murmur ran through the assembly, because such a thing had never been done before. The Sultani motion is highly irregular. A Netherian representative objected. humanity has only been in contact with galactic civilization for 3 months. And we know almost nothing about their culture and their history and their long-term intentions. We know everything we need to know. The Varani delegation leader said, and he stood with visible effort because he had been one of the workers trapped in the deep tunnels. We know that when we called into the void, these people answered, and we know that they risked everything for strangers, and we know that they value life above their own safety. And what more do we need to know? We need to know if they can be trusted with the power they possess. The Netherian insisted. They are Deathworlders from a Class 12 hazard world, and they have demonstrated physical capabilities that exceed our entire collective military force. And if they chose to use that strength for conquest rather than rescue, then they would have already done so. Voreth interrupted, and his mandibles clicking with agitation. I have analyzed every interaction humanity has had with galactic civilization, and every single contact has been characterized by cooperation and curiosity and compassion, and they have offered technological assistance to less advanced species, and they have shared cultural information freely, and they have demonstrated nothing but peaceful intent, and when tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Lyra added, they chose to help rather than to exploit, and they chose to save rather than to abandon, and they chose to give rather than to take. The debate continued for hours, and voices rising, falling as the implications were examined from every angle. Some species were genuinely frightened of humanity's capabilities and their concerns. We're not entirely without merit, because a species that could survive Talos 7 could survive almost anything, and could potentially do almost anything but. Other species saw something different in the humans. They saw a people who had been forged in the crucible of a hostile world, and had emerged not as conquerors, but as protectors. They saw a civilization that had learned to value cooperation because survival demanded it. They saw potential allies who would stand beside you when the darkness came. Finally, Theron called for a vote. All those in favor of granting humanity immediate full council membership? The vote was not unanimous, and 2 species abstained out of fear and concern and legitimate questions about the future, but the overwhelming majority voted yes. The human delegation watched from their observation pod as the results were displayed, and Santos standing at the front with her arms still in a sling from Talos 7. The motion passes, Theron announced, and his voice carrying genuine warmth. Humanity is hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and privileges and responsibilities therein, and welcome to the greater community. Santos activated her microphone and her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. On behalf of humanity, I accept this honor and this responsibility, she said, and I promise you that we will be the same people in times of peace that we were in the tunnels of Talos 7. And we will help when help is needed, and we will stand with you when you need someone to stand beside you, and we will share what we have, and we will protect what needs protecting. And this is who we are, and this is who we will always be. The feeds showed celebrations erupting across human space, and people in Earth cities dancing in the streets, and people on colony worlds raising glasses to their newest achievement. But in the hospitals on Talos 7, human doctors worked quietly alongside Varani medics, treating the last of the injuries from the rescue. And in the temporary shelters, human engineers sat with Varani families, planning the reconstruction of the colony. And in a small medical tent, Jackson sat beside a Varani child, teaching her a game from Earth while his shoulder healed, because for humans, the celebration was secondary to the work that still needed doing. 6 months passed. The galaxy learned what it meant to have Deathworlders as members of the community there. Salula. 1 year after the Talos 7 rescue, the memorial was unveiled on the colony grounds. It stood 3 stories tall and carved from a single piece of the mountain that had nearly become a tomb for 3,000 Varani workers, and at its center was a sculpture showing human and Varani hands clasped together in solidarity and strength. The inscription was written in both languages, and the words simple but profound. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day, and they learned not to face death alone. And when we called into the void, the Deathworlders answered, and they brought hope with them. Captain Santos stood before the memorial with Administrator Kelvin beside her and thousands of beings from dozens of species gathered. For the ceremony 1 year ago today, Kelvin began, and his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. We faced certain death, and our own people could not save us, and the Galactic Council calculated the odds and determined rescue was impossible, and we prepared ourselves for the... And he paused and looked at the human delegation standing nearby, and then these beings appeared. Kelvin continued. These strange creatures from a nightmare world that we could barely comprehend, and they did not calculate odds, and they did not debate possibilities, and they did not prepare condolences, and they simply came, a Varani child, stepped forward, and the same one who had been trapped with Okonkwo in the deep tunnels, and she carried a bundle of earth flowers that humans had helped her grow in the harsh Telosvi soil. I was very scared in the dark, young Talia said, and her voice was small, but steady. And I thought I would die there, but then David came and he stayed with me, and he sang songs, and he told me stories about whales, and he promised his friends would dig us out. She looked up at Okonkwo, who stood with the other rescue team members, and they did, Talia said with a smile. Because humans keep their promises, she placed the flowers at the base of the memorial. Santos stepped forward when called upon, and her expression thoughtful as she gazed at the monument. Administrator Kelvin asked me to say a few words about why we came. She began, and I have been thinking about how to explain it in a way that makes sense to species who did not evolve on a death world. She gestured to the memorial and the clasped hands. Earth taught us many things, Santos said. It taught us to be strong, because weakness meant death, and it taught us to be clever, because stupidity meant death, and it taught us to be resilient, because giving up meant death, but most importantly, it taught us that survival is a team effort. The crowd listened in absolute silence. When earthquakes struck our cities, we learned to dig each other out. Santos continued. When floods destroyed our homes, we learned to share what we had, and when fires consumed our forests, we learned to stand together against the flames, and when diseases threatened our populations, we learned to care for the sick. Even at risk to ourselves, she looked out at the faces watching her, and at Barani and Valorians, and Krell and Sultani and Etherians, and a dozen other species. We learned that the person you save today might be the person who saves you tomorrow, Santos said. We learned that strength without compassion is just cruelty, and we learned that the ability to help carries with it the responsibility to help, and these are not unique human concepts, and these are universal truths that Earth taught us in the harshest classroom imaginable. She paused and smiled slightly. So when you ask why we came to Talos V, the answer is simple. Santos concluded, we came because you needed help, and we could provide it, and no other reason is necessary, and no other justification is required. And that is who we are, and that is who we will always be. Theron stood from his seat in the audience. In his aged face showing emotion he did not try to hide 1 year ago, the galaxy learned what Deathworlders truly are, he said, and his voice carrying the weight of his position as council speaker. And we learned that the most dangerous thing about humanity is not their strength or their resilience or their ability to survive the unsurvivable. He walked to stand. Besides Santos, the most dangerous thing about humanity, Theron said with a smile, is their compassion and their unwillingness to accept that anyone should die alone, and their stubborn insistence that impossible odds are just difficult odds, and their absolute conviction that every life has value, worth fighting for. He clasped Santos's hand in the traditional human gesture. You have changed us, Theron told her, and told all of humanity through her. You have shown us that strength can be gentle, and that power can be protective, and that the beings we should fear least are often the ones who can hurt us most. The memorial ceremony continued, with speeches from rescued workers and with performances by Varani children singing Earth songs they had learned, and with human engineers demonstrating the reconstruction techniques they had developed specifically for Talos Vibat. The real story was being written across the galaxy in 1,000 small moments in a medical facility on the Sultani homeworld. A human doctor worked alongside Sultani physicians developing new treatments for a rare genetic disorder, and sharing human medical knowledge freely without patent restrictions or profit motives. In the Korvax Military Academy, human instructors taught survival techniques to cadets from a dozen species and emphasizing cooperation and mutual support over individual achievement in a research station orbiting a neutron star. Human scientists worked with Valorian astronomers on projects that neither species could accomplish alone, in combining human resilience with Valorian theoretical brilliance on Earth itself. The first Galactic Council embassy was constructed and designed to be comfortable for all member species and hosting cultural exchanges and educational programs and diplomatic functions that brought the galaxy together. Young humans applied to join the Galactic Rescue Service in numbers that overwhelmed the recruitment system, and each one citing the Talos 7 incident as their inspiration.
Ow.
"I want to help people the way Captain Santos helped the Varani," was the most common answer on application forms. The galaxy was changing. Species that had viewed each other with suspicion for centuries found common ground in working alongside humans who treated everyone with the same kindness. Technologies that had been jealously guarded were shared more freely as species tried to emulate humanity's open-handed approach to knowledge. Conflicts that might have escalated to violence were resolved through dialogue because no one wanted to disappoint the Deathworlders, who had shown such faith in galactic civilization, and everywhere humans went, they brought with them that same philosophy that Earth had beaten into them over millions of years of evolution: help when you can, and protect the vulnerable, and share what you have and stand together. It was not complicated. It was not even particularly noble in human eyes. It was just survival. 6 months after the memorial ceremony, the Galactic Council faced its first major crisis since humanity's admission. Rogue Planet on a collision course with the heavily populated Netherian colony of New Prometheus, and evacuation was impossible in the time remaining, and every calculation showed the colony was doomed. The council convened an emergency session, and the debate was brief because everyone knew what would happen next. "Has anyone notified the humans?" someone asked. They had. The human response fleet arrived within 18 hours and carrying equipment that most species had never seen before, and technologies that existed only because humans had spent centuries fighting their own hostile world. "Council observers, this is Admiral Chen," a familiar voice announced, and the same Chen who had led rescue teams in the Talos 7 tunnels, now commanding humanity's crisis response fleet. "We are beginning planetary deflection operations and request that all civilian vessels maintain safe distance." What followed was impossible. Humans deployed gravity generators developed for asteroid mining and plasma drives designed for star lifting and structural field emitters that existed only because Earth's frequent earthquakes had demanded better construction technology. They wrapped the rogue planet in an artificial gravity well, and they fired thrusters that could move moons, and they calculated trajectories with precision that only a species used to navigating through asteroid fields and gravitational anomalies could achieve. For 72 hours, humanity fought against celestial mechanics, and when the rogue planet's course shifted by 3 degrees, and 3 degrees was enough, and New Prometheus was saved, the Netherians, who had once questioned humanity's trustworthiness, wept openly as they watched their colony survive. Why? The Netherian ambassador asked Chen when the crisis was over. "My people objected to your council membership, and we abstained from the vote, and we doubted your intentions, and yet you saved us anyway." Chen smiled, that same tired but genuine smile that seemed universal among humans, "because you needed help." He said simply, "And we could provide it, and your vote 1 year ago does not change the fact that there are 8 million Netherians on that colony who deserve to live, and the math is not complicated." The ambassador stared at him for a long moment. "I was wrong about your people," he said finally. "I was wrong to fear you. You were not entirely wrong to be cautious." Chen replied gently, "We are capable of great destruction, and our strength is real, and our resilience is formidable, and but you made one critical mistake in your assessment."